Hey everybody. Okay. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Welcome to the December SERI webinar, Laying Track While on the Train, Developing an Information Governance Framework in M365. I'm Bonnie Weddle. I work at the New York State Archives, and I'm a member of the State Electronic Records Initiative's Education and Programming Subcommittee. If you haven't already done so, please take this opportunity to use the chat feature to let us know who you are, where you work, and the number of people, if any, who are attending this webinar with you. Also, if you have any specific electronic records management or digital preservation training concerns, please let us know. Education and programming is in the final stages of assembling the spring 2023 slate of webinars, and we want to be sure that our offerings are relevant to you. Before we get started, I want to say just a few words about our upcoming webinars. We're still trying to nail down the date for January's webinar. We've got, I believe, 5 presenters. So just finding a date that works for everyone is proving to be a bit of a challenge, but it is going to focus on the State Electronic Records Initiative itself and on COSA's new website, which contains a wealth of new resources, so stay tuned. Other early 2023 offerings will focus on using ArcGIS story maps and on litigation holds. And information about them will be posted on COSA's website and social media accounts. I would also like to draw your attention to COSA's Resource Center, which contains an ever-expanding array of information relating, among other things, to electronic records management and digital preservation tools, workflows, and best practices, and to COSA's YouTube account, which contains recordings of past SERI webinars. This recording of this webinar will be added shortly, and an ever-growing number of educational videos relating to bit rot, metadata, custody transfers, and other electronic records topics. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Preservica, which is the State Electronic Records Initiative's 2022 sponsor. Preservica's support helps make this webinar and some of the resources you'll find in COSA's Resource Center possible. And with that, on to our main event. Please note that we're going to hold questions until the end. However, please feel free to type any questions you may have into the chat box at any point during today's presentation. We're lucky to have Kris Stenson with us today. Kris is the State Records Manager at the Oregon State Archives. He holds a master's degree in history from Washington State University and a master's in library science from Indiana University, and became a certified records manager just last month. Congratulations, Kris. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Welcome, everyone. So I figured I'd get right out of the way. What's with that weird clunky title? Well, if any of you are familiar with Wallace and Gromit, there's a famous scene, and I don't recall which one of the shorts, which features Gromit stuck on a toy train and frantically laying down track as he goes along. I felt it's an apt metaphor for the sort of work that I find myself doing constantly, which is we are actively adopting and moving into technology that is not yet fully built, and we don't yet know exactly how we're going to get to where we're getting in the end. And especially within, as I talk a little bit about our journey in the state of Oregon with Microsoft 365, it's especially apt because some of the tools that we are now going to be embracing to do what we want to do didn't even exist when we jumped into M365 and I started talking about retention in 2020. So there's a lot of rapid change, and it just is the way it is now. So I think partially, I think I've done other presentations in the past with things like getting comfortable with discomfort, things like that. And that's essentially the mantra these days, which is you're never going to have all the information and you're going to have to adjust on the fly within sort of broad frameworks. Next slide, please. All right. So I want to give you a little background on where things were at within the state of Oregon in terms of technology prior to our adoption of M365. Now, the M365 adoption was not all at once. It was a gradual phased rollout that took several years and was already in progress when things really accelerated in March of 2020. And so what we've often seen is a mixture of different technologies, only half integrated. So there is a central IT services agency within Oregon, but they handle directly the IT of about 80% of agencies, but not all of them. Some of those agencies they actually have as client agencies where they directly support them on like a desktop sort of support, and others they simply provide the server infrastructure and backbone. So It's all over the place. I am within the Secretary of State's office, which is an independent agency, which handles a lot of our own. At the same time, we still do connect to some of the same central services. So this is particularly challenging in the past. There was a lack of any widespread or really any retention or governance within systems. And I'm using a very broad term here, systems being any sort of data keeping system, HR systems, payroll systems, specialty databases at different agencies, right? Almost no retention rules built into any of them, much less comprehensive ones. Email, like with so many states, this will probably sound familiar, was shoved all into a vault that was instituted somewhere in the late 2000s. And basically the idea was that, oh, we're preserving our stuff now. And then that rapidly got way too big to handle. And it's just been growing and growing and growing ever since with no destruction being done. Lack of coordination between statewide IT and records management meant that this didn't get much better. Now, this is something we've been nibbling around the edges on for years and years and years, of course, but generally speaking, the two groups didn't have a constant working relationship, and it wasn't clear from the top down who bore responsibility for what. So there were lots of areas for improvement, as they would say, prior to moving towards where we're at now. So next slide, please. There we go. So in early 2020, March 16th or something like that, actually, everybody went home in the state of Oregon, right? The initial lockdown, oh, those heady days when we baked bread and thought it would all be over in a few months. You've heard this 1,000 times. It's not even funny anymore, but it's what we say. So right around then, M365 rollout was beginning. It was planned already. However, the move suddenly of the entire state workforce to work from home, at least temporarily, meant it was rolled out really fast in a lot of places, well ahead of schedule, without a whole lot of governance or oversight. And I don't blame them for that, right? We needed a tool right now, and we'll worry about the rest later. And that's what happened. So we all jumped into it and kind of then tried to figure out how exactly are we supposed to use this. We saw this, and we being State Archives, the Records Management Unit in particular, saw this as an opportunity, right? So this was a chance for us to actually get in on the ground floor and a chance to chart a path from something that everybody was a little baffled by, right? There was an opportunity because statewide IT didn't really understand the tool that much yet. It's not like we were coming in as the interlopers. Everybody was on the same page. And it was a perfect situation that you had to take, right? If we didn't jump forward, we would have been left out permanently and be the same problems we used to have. So it actually happened through an interesting bit of circumstances where folks at an agency I had worked with reached out to me and mentioned something about the Central Services Agency wanting to do a default retention for email. And I said, oh, and they asked, were you involved in this decision making? And I said, no, but I know who to call. So I called a partner of mine, Catherine Darnell Helms, who is the State Chief Data Officer, which is a fairly new position, had only been established in 2019. And I said, hey, do you know anything about this proposed email retention thing? She said, actually, I'm involved in the M365 project team. I'll bring you on for the next meeting. And so I joined, and that was, I think, that would have been late in 2020. I joined this group and had some initial conversations that some of them were a little hard initially, where I had to say, I'm sorry, but your nice one-size-fits-all plan is not going to work the way you think it will. And we can't do that. However, it very rapidly morphed into a very productive working relationship where I started to learn more about the systems. They started to learn more about records retention, and we really began formulating a plan. Now, that plan was not fully vetted. We didn't know exactly how we were going to do it, but we had a general sense of what we were going to do. So being involved in that, and I was then a member of that team in all their meetings through as well as the broader M365 Advisory Council, which is comprised of stakeholders from different agencies to this day. And all throughout the rollout, which didn't get completed until the end of 2021 with all the agencies, and then transitioning now where I'm involved in a working group of them to now do the governance part, right? We're actually going to be rolling out the retention part, but using resources shared between our two agencies, which is a pretty cool thing that never really happened before. Of course, the challenge with getting this stuff done was there were limited resources. As always, there was a legislative mandate that the entire state had to be in M365 by the end of, I don't know if they actually made the deadline or not. I think we had to extend it by 6 months, but nonetheless, it had to get done. And then at the same time, the legislature cut the funding for the project team, so they lost half their FTEs they were going to have to do it. So obviously, like always, do this thing, but do it in half the time with less people, and we will hold you accountable if you don't. This is a typical thing in government. I'm sure you've experienced before. Next slide, please. Right. So this started out as a place where how do we balance our sort of competing, and not always competing, but just different perspectives and desires in this, right? So from the IT perspective, the number one goal was to make this as simple as possible. That meant, as much as we could, making it one size fits all, right? We're not doing bespoke implementations. There's over 72, 75, the number varies depending on which board or commission's been created, but there's 70 odd agencies that DAS is responsible for providing some level of technology infrastructure for, right? And one cannot effectively manage those if every single one has their own little setup, their own unique way, right? It had to be bulk rules. And at the same time, they wanted central control, because in the past, many agencies sort of had rogue applications that was 50-50, they did their own thing. And yes, your perspective on that may vary very much depending on whether you work for that central services agency or one of the client agencies, on whether or not it's good or bad to be independent. There are benefits and drawbacks to both. I can see from the centralized side, you want to coordinate control so that you limit your information security risks, that you have good information governance, so that you can minimize your, that you can be as efficient as possible in terms of your IT resources, because of course, the more different things are done, the more work you spend trying to slap them all back together and manage them. So that's the starting perspective there, right? Can we make this all one thing, right? You all get a square box, and that's what it is. Now, from a records management perspective, ideally, and this is not necessarily where I landed, but this is generally what records management would typically say, which is we want precision, right? We want accuracy and precision for our rules, so that they can accurately reflect the different business of the agencies. We want the ability to customize it so that we can do a size to fit, right, where it needs to be, which is something we've done in the past. And we would like the agency to have some control over that, so that they can make their own ownership decisions about their records. Now, pros of this, right, is theoretically it can give the ability to do really good records management. However, cons of it, well, but is it going to happen, right? It's more costly, it's more complicated. You will inevitably have some agencies do a good job and some not. So this also is not something you'd want to do whole hog, right? You're going to have to find a compromise point in the middle. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Chris, my keyboard is stuck.
Oh no.
Let me see what I can do.
I'll sit here and smile.
Oh.
I think.
Yeah.
There we go.
There we go.
Thank you.
Sorry.
All right. No, it's okay. In an emergency, I can probably pull up mine somewhere and we can do from there. So a practical compromise, right? So this is, and this was not an instantaneous thing, I would note, right? This is over a span of many months and many conversations with lots of different stakeholders. So first of all, we had to get from the point where IT started, which was everything's the same. There's no exceptions. Agencies just have to file stuff on their own. It doesn't fall within that rule, right? Well, we know from long experience that that's just the old way of doing things and it doesn't work. So that was not going to be particularly effective. So IT agreed to allow agencies some control. Now, I'll get to exactly where that fits in a little bit, but some control, right? On our side, we agreed to limit the possible variables, right? So if you can think how many different potential retentions there are within a state, well, there's probably, at least a couple hundred when you factor in all the variants like when case closed and this and that and the other thing, right? So however, we said, no, we're not going to ask to program in 100 different retentions within the system, right? So we're saying we're going to reduce this, okay? So we're going to use the principles of role-based retention, which is in turn loosely based upon the principles of capstone, which I don't need to describe to this audience, I'm certain. However, it's a little more granular than that. But the idea being is that the role dictates the retention, and many people hold the same role. Therefore, we don't need to get too in the weeds about what precise person does which and in what time, and all of the different permutations. So basically, the idea is that we would use this process to establish baseline retentions, and that would mean just that, right? This is your starting point for any given working group, and specific group exceptions. That would be key identified groups, but the key here is almost all situations, it is not individual exceptions, it is group exceptions, so that we are not getting down to the granular. I forget how many employees the state of Oregon has. Depending on which state you have it, maybe more or less. I know we probably have upwards of 50 or 60,000 employees, right? You're not going to be doing this individually. And I could be way off on that. I honestly don't know off the top of my head. So where we went to, remember that I mentioned there was a default retention proposed. Well, that was a 3-year default retention is what they said, but they wanted to be universal. However, we use that as our default retention applied to all communications and files within SharePoint. Now, for those of you who may not be totally familiar with M365 and how it's structured, essentially everything is in SharePoint. So well, two things. You have Exchange, which is all your emails, and SharePoint, which is just about everything else. So whether you call it Teams or OneDrive or whatever else, it's all living in SharePoint. So basically 3-year default. So if you do nothing as a state employee of Oregon, your stuff will be worth 3 years, or will be retained 3 years, right? That's the starting point. Why 3 years? It seemed like a pretty good spot, right? It's gonna go past the majority of your very short-term administrative records, right? Your notes and copies and whatnot that maybe only 1 or 2 years. It's actually going to handle a lot of frontline staff, just like if you work in a call center, right? You're not going to have anything more than that. So that's a good baseline retention. It's also long enough for anybody to realistically think they might need to go back and use it, right? When's the last time you actually needed something from longer ago than that? And then we created a limited set of alternative retentions, right? So this is going to be your groups that we can, these tags that we can apply. So if you do nothing, it's 3 years. If we apply these other labels, it will take over from that. So I believe I have those listed on the next slide. And if I don't, I'll just say them. Maybe I don't. I can't remember if it's on a following slide, so I'm just going to say it right now. Those limited retentions we came up with were 5, 7, 10, 15, oh, sorry, 10, sorry, yeah. 5, 7, 10, 20, and permanent. 5 alternative retentions, right? I didn't come up with those numbers out of thin air. What we did is we actually did some very quick analysis of all of our existing general schedules, and we just charted out the frequency of different retentions. And we looked at where the peaks and valleys were, and we rounded some columns up, right? So we had all these here between 3 and 5. We said, okay, all of those 4 years are in 5 now, right? Why 7? Because there actually are quite a few 6s and quite a few 7s, because that relates to tax cycles and audit stuff. And so we just say, okay, anything that's a 6 is a 7, right? So 5, 7, 10 are going to be the heavy use categories. That 20 is for your kind of like a lot of agency director types, and then permanent, senior elected officials, occasionally agency directors, just depends, right? So that's our baseline set. Now, will we come up with more? Probably. If there's a compelling case where we need to create another category, that's fine. The key here is just keeping them low, right? No more than 10 at most, right? And ideally less. So keeping this as simple as possible. Now, how do we do role-based retention? You may have noted the little asterisk there, right? So it's a simple formula that, you know, the detail, it's all in the details, but essentially we look at the work products coming out of a given unit. And then we look at the existing schedules that apply, whether that's a special schedule for the agency or a general schedule that covers all state agencies. And we look at which the longest likely retention is for those work products, right? So you simply say, okay, look, that one's a 6, that one's a 10. If there's nothing longer than 10, guess what? You get a 10-year default for that unit. Now, we do sometimes discount the real big outliers, right? Once in a blue moon, there's one out here and it's 75 years. Well, that's not going to live in your email or here. That's not an appropriate place. So that's a separate thing. So we're going to compare those functions and apply it based upon the longest likely retention. This is not a complicated thing. It's a very straightforward process. Obviously, it can be time consuming because you just have to go through and look at the stuff and make a decision. And this is something we've actually been talking about for years, but this is our first opportunity to really apply it en masse because we have the tools built in and the ability to apply them in bulk without being beholden on others to sort of do this out of the goodness of their souls. I don't know. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. I did have them here. You know, this is the thing. I sometimes forget what I say. So 3-year baseline, I mentioned that. Here's our plan. Our menu of retention labels, 5, 7, 10, 20 permanent. So my records management team will meet with agency IT administrators and records officer, and we will train them on role-based retention, right? We are not going to be doing this for every agency, I can tell you that. We have a very small team. At full staffing, I have 8 people, you know, and that includes all of our functions, right? Currently, and for those of you, a little pitch out there, I'm going to be recruiting for a couple very shortly, so FYI. So we don't have a lot of people. We have to do sort of the train and trainer method. So we're going to be running some workshops, and I'll get to that in the communications plan that's being percolated out right now. But we're going to be doing through workshops and centralized planning, and then we're going to sort of put that out there. Now, for those of you who really like the nerdy bits in the system, we are using a tool called Adaptive Scope Policy Application within M365. If that means nothing to you, it's okay. It meant nothing to me until this summer when I attended a workshop and learned about this one in more depth. So there are lots of ways to apply retention policies with M365. Some of them, unfortunately, do not work en masse. So that's something we had to develop. And this is the tool that didn't exist in 2020, and I mentioned. In fact, it didn't exist at the beginning of 2021. I think it was just launched at the beginning of 22. So this tool allows for bulk application based upon metadata triggers that can be applied to someone's user profile or to a Teams or SharePoint site, that sort of thing. So basically, it's a mechanism we're going to use to group users and attach retention labels. So in this case, our labels are, again, those numbers. It's just simple, 5, 7, 10, 20 permanent, right? Those are our labels. We're going to use this policy within the system to say, if you see this characteristic on their profile, apply this thing. And what we're using is literally one of the blank fields in someone's Active Directory profile. We all have a user profile that within this like syncs up everything. It's going to be an empty field. And we're going to say, hey, in field 6, you're going to put the number 5, 7, 10, 20, or a P. That's it. And this policy will look at those and see if there's one there. And if so, it will apply the correct label. It will apply the label to your stuff. It's pretty straightforward, really. It's actually using a very complex tool to do a very simple thing, because there is a more direct way to apply. But unfortunately, what we found is that in certain tools, they only go up to a certain user cap. And that user cap for one more direct method of applying labels was 1,000. Well, we have agencies with way more people, so that was never going to work. And so this same tool can be used to trigger off of, keywords within documents. It's often used to identify sensitivity labels, things like that, right? Social security numbers. It can be used for much more complex things. We're doing it very simple. We're saying, hey, super smart tool, I'm going to ask you to do a really dumb thing, which is look in one place and one place only, for a very limited controlled vocabulary. So agencies would be the ones. So the agencies within this structure, so say you get a new employee. As part of that new employee onboarding, you create a new user profile, which then goes back to the central services, but you create it locally if you are the local IT, right? So you create that user profile. Kris Stenson has a new user profile. And as part of that process, they're going to attach a retention. Oh, got excited there, Bonnie.
Yeah. Sorry.
They're going to attach that label, that simple numerical code to that section. And if they're a 3-year default, they don't get anything in that spot. So that, of course, means the records officers need to have done their job first, and we've identified this, right? So that's the part that happens before the technical bit. But so anyways, and all the content generated by those users will get that specified retention. All the content, and we can choose where to apply it. Currently, we're looking at Exchange and OneDrive, which is like your own personal little stash within SharePoint. That would also get applied based upon your personal profile. Labels can also be attached within SharePoint sites and Teams, but with those areas, now that's not in our initial phased rollout, that's going to be the second step. Those will not be triggered based upon a user because, of course, those are shared spaces. Those are going to be applied at the team or SharePoint site level. So basically, everything within that site would be treated a single way. There is also the possibility for people to apply labels more granularly. I'm not blocking that feature yet, but nor are we featuring it, because obviously that gets into, do you really know what you're doing sort of territory? And we're taking this phase step at a time, as simple as possible, right? Important thing to note for the correspondence, things like that, that's going to be from the date created, of course. The date that thing hits the system is when that clock starts. How we're going to be setting it up for things within Teams, document stores, things like that within SharePoint, those are going to be based upon the date last modified. Now, why would we do that? Well, because some of these retentions are a little squishier than that. And there's a big concern that, hey, this active use document we're doing all the time might disappear on us, because not everything in Teams is a long-term record, but it's something we're constantly, it's one of those until superseded, but we're constantly superseding it within the same document. So you don't want your tracking spreadsheet to disappear because it was created 3 years ago. So in that case, once you stop updating it and abandon it, essentially, it will have that clock ticking on it. So in that way, people won't lose the things they use all the time, but we also avoid dead letter stores, right? Where we just have stuff dumped and left forever. Next slide, please. Okay. Now on the data governance side, I haven't talked a lot about this because I'm doing this one without my partner, but just so you're aware, there's a parallel conversation happening regarding management of data within the system from a security and an access standpoint. So they're working on updating data classification policies. So the state of Oregon has levels of asset classification, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4, am I thinking? And they correspond to basically 1 is super public, 2 is limited, usually to within your own agency, certainly within the state. 3 is God, no, I'm blank on the terminology. Sensitive, whatever, sensitive critical data. And that stuff is generally going to be stuff you don't want to reveal unless you have to. And then 4 is level 4 data is like prison blueprints, right? It's the sort of stuff where life and limb could be a danger. We don't have a lot of that, but theoretically we could have it in here. So there'll be training agencies on how to apply those, and they might use a similar tool. That hasn't gone as far yet. They're going to be incorporating document sensitivity labeling into M365. One of the features that's going to be turned on is that anytime you create a document and put it into SharePoint or Teams, it's going to ask you for a level classification on it. It's not turned on yet, but it's going to be to sort of force that identification. And of course, then there's going to be training and rollout of the labeling for external sharing, which is that's the next frontier we have not yet turned on, which is, hey, I want to be able to share this draft with an outside party so they can edit it directly, which would be very nice. But there's a lot of overlapping security concerns with this, right? How do you verify? Are we trusting their verification system or not? How do we do two-factor? All that fun stuff, right? So there's a lot of complicated things, which is why that takes a little longer. Next slide, please. So communications, obviously, communications are essential for any big rollout like this. People get scared. I've been talking to folks for a long time. So Catherine and I actually did what we called M365 roadshows in 2020 and 21, where we talked in broad strokes about retention and data classification within M365 without giving a lot of specifics. We said, hey, this is a thing that's going to be coming. We're going to be doing this, just getting you comfortable with the thought, introducing ourselves to them so they knew who they could contact if they had questions about it, that sort of fun stuff. Also, on my part, a way to let agencies know, hey, if you have a super out-of-date schedule, probably a good time to call my office because we're going to need to take care of this, right? So we did those for a couple years until everybody was on board. Basically, we did them until people stopped signing up for them. We just did it until we're like, we have nobody. The M365 Advisory Committee, as I mentioned briefly, I'm on that. That is comprised of stakeholders from, gosh, I think 25 or so different agencies, where we discuss potential changes to M365. Obviously, Microsoft is constantly rolling out new features, some of which seem really cool, but probably present more issues than not. Others are, hey, what default settings should we have, right? Should we allow for auto transcription of all of our Teams meetings or not? Should it be an option to agencies? Should it be an option that's automatically turned on or automatically turned off, and they have to select the opposite, right? So we have to balance these competing desires and needs to balance those with overarching need for governance with agency needs. And so this body discusses those things, and we also share information with each other's agencies. And then that actually goes up a higher level, right? We don't make the final decision. We make a recommendation, which then goes up to statewide IT governance that make the actual call on that. But generally speaking, they go with our recommendations. I don't recall being vetoed on anything significant thus far. So the plan going forward for communications is in January and February of this coming spring, I, with a group of folks from DAS, are going to be doing retention roadshows, specifically talking about what I'm talking to folks today. We're going to be introducing the concepts to anybody that will attend. So we've been talking about the outreach strategy, and we're like, listen, do you have a mailing list? Is there a group of you guys? Let's hit them all, right? So that means the groups for the finance officers and the legal teams and the IT, the CIO groups, all of those state groups we're going to be hitting and saying, hey, send people to these, tell your friends, these are anybody, y'all come now, right? So this is so that we can get the word out as much, right? We're just trying to talk as much as we can. Those might be, I don't know how frequent those will be. Those might be close to weekly if we're doing these things. I plan on following those up in February and March with technical webinars, which would be for our IT staff, where I talk to them a little bit more about what tool we're using in M360, because I'm not going to hit the general audience with that, right? They're going to glaze over and they're going to say, what now and how? So I don't want to do that. So this will be more for the IT folks. We're going to say, okay, so here's actually how we're going to do it. Here's the mechanics of it. So those will be a little more targeted. As we go along with this, we'll also be creating written guides and resources that will document this process. I owe the team a few of those before the end of the month, which seemed a lot more achievable when that was a month ago. And right now I'm sweating under a bunch of other, that was before I suddenly found myself 2 people down and had some other logistical issues to take care of. So we'll see, working on it. So written guides and resources, and then spread through official state IT. So the idea is that we have the clout there, right? We have a lot more visibility than we used to have with statewide records management, but there's nothing like getting it through the official channels. They're used to getting it through and as well as from me. So to make sure this is something you don't want to ignore. So we're going to be sending it out to all of our groups. I'll be sending to my records officers and to the other professional groups. More is more, right? This is a shotgun strategy. We are sending this to anybody with a pulse and an email address, right? Because if they don't want to read it, fine. But the more eyeballs we get on it, the more likely we're going to have success. Next slide, please. So what do we have to do? A lot. This is a big task, and I have no illusions that it's going to be quick. So we're going to need to make sure that all the schedules are reasonably up to date, right? So I may have mentioned earlier, we have general schedules in the state. We are actively working on all of those right now, which is a huge task on its own. We have 5 of those that we're working on. Special schedules also exist for most of the state agencies that relate specifically to their agency's work, right? So transportation, prisons, you name it, right? So anybody that has a schedule that hasn't been updated in, say, the last 4 or 5 years, we're going to be like, hey, we really need to look at this, because we can't do effective role-based retention analysis if the information is not correct, right? How are we going to establish baselines if that doesn't reflect your actual work? And so we will be doing that across the board, and that's going to take some time. It's going to be kind of a constant churning thing, right? We're working with one agency in one place and another in another. We're going to be doing system of record work with agency records officers. And for those who may not be totally comfortable with that term, system of record is simply, where does your stuff live? It's just an offshoot of a proper records inventory. The idea is this is where it lives, and this is where it's supposed to live. So an inventory might say this is where everything's currently at. A system of record list is, this is the official place that this kind of record is supposed to land. So obviously this has to happen after a schedule has been updated, but that's going to list all the both electronic, primarily for our concerns here, the electronic spaces where these live. And so why would we do that? Well, because if certain types of records have officially a home that is not M365, that means that retention, that series is not going to go into our consideration for the role-based retention, right? We don't have to worry about that. They don't live there. So that's going to be for our state. That's going to be most of the financial records. They have their own systems, and the HR records, they have their own systems. So it helps us narrow down a lot on what we actually have to consider on the role-based retention. And then, of course, role-based retention training and facilitation. We're going to be creating more resources. This, we're hoping, will waterfall, right? So once a couple agencies have it under their belt, they will be advocates and will be able to help other agencies too. So I'm really hoping we will have sort of a force multiplier that way. And then we will be populating all those policies within the tenants. So for those familiar with M365, how it's structured, we have multiple tenants, which is how many people live within the same data giant sphere, so to speak. And we have about 15 of them currently. They try to consolidate them a bit. Some agencies are so big that it's not practical to put them with others. There's a whole bunch of us in one. So we will need to be basically replicating our retention policy creation in every single data set so that it works across all of them the same way. So we will be doing that. And then, of course, as agencies get through these steps, they're going to then start applying that metadata we identified on their user profiles. And so then that will start, it will actually start grabbing those policies based upon what we've set up. Next slide, please. So road ahead. So we had an initial target date of July 1st, 2024, beginning of fiscal year. Why? Well, that's because we officially started the 3-year default clock in July 2021. Will we have everybody done by July 1st, 2024? Absolutely not. A couple years ago, this seemed more achievable, but a lot of delays, some agencies, just things happen, right? And that's okay. Currently, our plan is for agencies that we have completed all the training and stuff for, and they've done the provisioning, they're going to go live. Retentions are going to go live on that date for them. Any agencies going up to that, so in June of that year, we're going to look, who haven't we gotten to yet? We're going to put a placeholder retention rule on all those agencies. Basically, we're going to put a stop order on all of those so that the retentions don't take effect, because we don't want them all to get the 3 years. So we'll be applying probably a 20-year to all of them, right? Just to protect them in a holding tank, because I didn't want to delay the implementation at agencies until the last one was done. At the same time, I like the deadline because it keeps people pushing. So we're going to keep pushing that deadline. So the idea is, if we can get half or 3/4 of agencies going live on that date, that's going to be a mass of junk that's gone, right? That's going to be a huge benefit for records management, risk limitation, liability, all that good stuff, all at the same time. And the rest of them we'll continue to work on. And hopefully it won't take us more than another 6 months or so to get that done. We'll see. It's really hard to say. It really depends on so many external factors that it's hard to adequately project. There is still an extensive backfile vault to deal with. And by this, largely, not only all the old legacy content that's on servers and old file shares and things like that, but largely the email vault, which I mentioned earlier is this gigantic thing. So there will be work to do. Now, once those retention labels go live and we've identified those lists, essentially agencies can use those role-based retention lists to go back and tell IT to say, okay, these accounts purge as of X number of years ago, right? We're going to start purging, but that's going to be a little more, it's going to be a chunky process, right, over time. We also have to ensure that the e-discovery portal is synced with our policies. So this is a fun thing that I learned early on, which is that when you delete stuff, even from Exchange, like not the user Outlook account, but from Exchange within M365, that's not the end of the story, because there's also an e-discovery portal that retains a duplicate copy of everything that hits the servers. Now, currently, basically as an emergency break on everything, we've got that set with a permanent litigation hold. Now that is so that even if something went weird in the meanwhile, nothing's going to take effect because it's still protected, and that's good. We will be releasing that, fingers crossed, on that go live date. That legal hold will be removed, and those agencies that are set will go live, and the others will have their protected retention set at the same time, and that will be that. A lot can change between now and then, but that's the plan, because the goal is to go forward with it. So the other issue is we need to make sure that going forward, that the e-discovery portal mirrors the retentions that are set within the main environment, unless there's a legal hold set, right? So the idea is if there's legal hold, that takes precedent, right? There's hierarchies of decision-making within the system like any other. But we need to make sure that that's done consistently, because otherwise, are we actually doing records management? No. All we're doing is making it look nice on the front end, and the back end, it's still the same garbage it always has been. So we have to make sure. Now, I've been told, and obviously I haven't been able to fully test this, but I've been told that when you apply these retention policies, it should sync up with the back end if there's no overriding hold in place. The proof will be in the pudding. We won't know until we actually try it. So it's one of those things. Sometimes you can't really test to the extent you'd like to. The other trick, of course, being is that I don't have full access to everything, right? I, as an external party, have access to what IT thinks I need access to, and I have to beg for access to other things like anybody else does. So this is not a small implementation that I'm running by myself. So it limits sometimes what I can do, but we're pretty confident this is how it's supposed to work. And if we trust that the tool is going to do what it says it's going to do, it should work. And there's plenty of precedent across the globe about this stuff. So we really make use of that global community. Incorporating external sharing and collaboration is another thing that with any luck will go live now, but then how do we manage that content, right? Are those people given temporary user licenses? Who owns that content? How is it going to pull a retention? Good question. I don't know. We're going to have to see how that behaves, and we'll have to look at the use cases to determine how that's done. So that's still an unknown. It's not high on my list, but we'll see, because there could be use cases where it's being used in sort of a Dropbox type fashion, which there's no reason for those to have more than a 30-day retention on them. It could be one where it's an ongoing thing. It's an ongoing external partner that you'll be working with for years, in which case it's a more long-term solution thing, and they're going to behave more like a regular user profile. So we'll probably have to look at those, as they come up. But that seems like small potatoes compared to the bulk of what we're dealing with here. And I think, oh, there we go. Unresolved questions, because there's always unresolved questions. How are we going to tackle stubborn agencies? Well, ain't that always the thing? Now, my current, maybe optimistic plan is that we're going to hit all the agencies that are raring to go first. And then by sheer mass of peer pressure, we're going to get the other ones to comply. They're not going to have a lot of choice in the matter. And that'll probably work in most cases. There will be some which we may need to go up the chain with. But the beauty of all this process and how we've made all these friends is that we now have people up the chain that will go to bat for us, which was never a thing in the past. So it's pretty cool. Will our current strategy hold as the software capabilities continue to change? Maybe, maybe not. But remember that whole laying track as we go along? Fine, we'll adjust, right? If they come up with a better tool to do this in the future, maybe we'll do that. Keeping in mind, we did this as a one-size-fits-all tool. There are more efficient ways to do it in small, limited cases, but that's not what we were going for, right? We were going for what would work in 100% of the circumstances we find ourselves in. And even if that means going about it in a kind of odd-looking way, because we are not doing custom stuff. So in the future, who knows? Independent agencies might do it a completely different way. And Microsoft might roll out some awesome new thing next year that totally makes all this obsolete. I don't know. I kind of hope not, because I don't want to keep redoing this constantly, but you never know. How do we balance the needs of smaller agencies with minimal IT support with larger agencies who can implement their own tenets, right? So there will be a balancing act there. We fully expect that my team will be doing much more legwork with the little guys, right? So if it's a little commission, right, with 2 staffers, we're not going to be asking, we're going to be doing their analysis for them most likely, because they just don't have the people, right? And that's okay. I'm not going to be doing the analysis for, say, the Oregon Health Authority, which has 13,000 employees. I'm not doing that for them. They have people. So it just depends. Who supports ongoing maintenance and oversight, right? And this is a discussion from the start, right? Who's supporting a help desk? Who's paying for what? How are we handling this, right? And it's been very clear from the start that while I'm involved in the technology side, because that's how we're doing it, I made it very clear that my team is not a help desk for this, right? We can't be. We don't have that sort of infrastructure. I don't have that sort of thing. And we are the records experts. We are helping our records officers, and I am helping facilitate this for the state. But beyond that point, we're kind of like an external consultant. And can this model be used to tackle other statewide applications? Obviously, the technologies will differ, but we have, I may have mentioned, we have statewide HR systems, and we have statewide finance systems that have their whole ecosystems on their own, right? So we're going to need to go in there afterwards and say, okay, now we need to implement retention within these. And we're essentially starting from square one again, because we're going to have to figure out how those systems tick, which is a whole nother thing. But our primary issue here was to tackle all of this unstructured data that didn't have a home. That's what we're tackling first, because it's the biggest and most annoying thing we deal with. So I think that's my last slide. It is. There we go. So happy to tackle questions that you may have.
Okay, Kris, thank you so much. I think I can access the chat box, and I'm going to try to do so without sending the slideshow flying into chaos as it did a few minutes ago. I have a question from Cindy, who, first of all, would like to thank you and would like to know what resources do you recommend for someone who needs to get an intro to the records management landscape of M365?
Yeah, so this is a tricky one. It took me a long time to sort of figure out as we went along. I would say once I have resources, I will make sure that they are shared. So that might give you a clue on how we're doing it. I actually, after years of trying to understand this thing, what I found most helpful is I attended an M365 workshop actually at the Nagara conference this last summer. We had somebody directly from Microsoft do a full day workshop on how to do retention within M365. And yes, it got a little technical, but I finally seemed to grasp what I was really going for there. So her name is Erica, and I'm missing her last name right now. I know they do other training events, but honestly, I would recommend going right to the source, because like I said, some of these things like this adaptive scope thing, it's so new. that other implementers don't even know about it, right? It's not used very much. So it's brand spanking new, which means the only place to get good resources is right from the source. We've also found the Microsoft help sites and the community and the forums to be pretty helpful on that front, if you can understand the lingo, right? That's always a trick. So if you are really not a techie person, you might find it hard. You don't have to be a computer guy, though, to understand it, right? It's still terminology. And if you think about it in terms of broad policies and labels, right? And once you can understand the label is the number, a label is just the number, the policy is how the system chooses where to apply that number. You can take a label and manually apply them, right? So you could take labels and have everybody set them on themselves. That's not complicated. That's just like doing paper filing. The policies are where they come in, where they say, okay, hey, system, please do this for us based upon this criteria, right? And that's just constructing search strings. That's constructing, we do this, right? Boolean logic, right? For those of us that went to library school and we learned all about how to do Boolean searches, it all hinges on our ability to create a good search query, on our ability to ask a good question, and then say, okay, system, when it answers this, do this. Don't worry, don't get hung up too much on the technical details. So I think early conversations I was involved with on some of the forums a year or two ago, a lot of the conversation got really in the weeds really early about, like, when you're the system admin, this and that and these things. Well, the reality is a lot of us aren't actually the system admin. And so it's important for us to understand roughly how it works and then go to our IT people and say, hey, I would like to apply a 3-year retention to everybody by default. Can you tell me how you would do that, right? So that's the real key there. We don't need to tell the IT people how to do it necessarily unless we're already involved in that conversation. What we need to do, right? Don't tell the technician how to do their job. Tell the technician what you need as an end product, and then you let them have that conversation. So that's my advice at this point. I don't have a lot of very specific documents to point you to, but certainly it's an ongoing conversation, and I would community forums are really helpful wherever they may be, because there's a lot of us tackling this same stuff.
Thanks, Kris. If anybody else has a question, please feel free to type it into the chat box. Oh, and someone just did.
I can actually read it. So
oh, okay.
I'll read it out loud for folks. Is the retention countdown clock triggered by date of creation or some other event? I'll answer that question first. You can choose. For things like communications, we're going to be doing it's from the date created, because of course, once it hits your inbox or you did the sent, whatever, that's the date created. We are going to be doing you can also trigger it off of, for documents, you can trigger it off of date last seen, date last opened, other types of events on it. We are choosing date last modified. And what that means is that any actively, does that mean certain things are going to get over retained? Yes. However, theoretically speaking, a record doesn't become a record until it's finalized, right? Theoretically speaking. And so you could say a working document is not yet a record, at least for retention purposes. It is for disclosure purposes in many cases. But so I have a tracking sheet that I use to see where we're at on all of our schedule revisions. And that, for example, is a living document. And as long as we're updating it, it'll keep resetting the clock. Every time I update it, it resets that 3-year clock or whatever. Also, how did the project address records for which the retention trigger wasn't a known date? Yes, list life of assets, employee separation from agency, etc. Yeah, so that's a good question. Those are not handled well by default rules. That's a good point. You can do it essentially 2 ways. Excuse me, reply. You can just do it essentially 2 ways. One is to say, what's the longest likely scenario, and simply apply a really long retention to it. That's what we've done in other systems in the past because it's much simpler, round it up and go for that. Or this is really not the system built well for those, right? This is not going to be the default retention system for the state. It's not configured that way. It's not how we're using it. Could you use it that way? You could. It would have to be configured differently. You'd have to really focus on that. It's not what we're doing. My idea is that this is sort of for short to intermediate term storage up to 10 years or so. So then you might ask, why do we have a 20-year or a permanent label? Well, it's so that metadata is already applied. And so when you transfer it to another system, you know what it's supposed to be. You don't want to make that retention decision later. So the idea is to make that retention decision at the beginning so that you know when it is time to transfer it to its forever home, however long that may be, you know what the retention is supposed to be. So that's why we have that. And like that also prevents premature deletion. That's the other thing. It just protects it. But yeah, so a lot of these things are going to be living in other systems. And if they're not, that's a conversation we'll have in that system of record research, right? When we work with agencies, where do these things live? Great, cool. Now, how are we going to handle that? So yeah, that's a lot of it. Understanding what it is and what it isn't. And for us, it's a complementary piece. Ideally, agencies also have a long-term repository. Not all of them do, many don't. We do. That's sort of our long-term e-record system. But we work with what they've got, and we'll figure that out as we go along.
Okay. Are there any other questions? All right, Kris, I actually have a question for you.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you've got some stubborn agencies. As I imagine, everyone has stubborn agencies. How are agency records managers? What's their response to all of this? I imagine it's a mix of enthusiasm and terror and just, well, I'm not going to do this.
Yeah, so it really depends on whether, I think it always hinges on, is that job a professional classification, or is this other duties as assigned put on somebody who doesn't really understand it? Unfortunately, the second model has been prevalent in state government for a very long time. However, we are seeing a notable shift. Now, the big agencies have typically had a designated records officer. We provide training for them. We talk to them a lot. We're partners in this. They understand their job. And most of them have been very enthusiastic about this because it has the potential to really make their job easier in the long term. And then for those others where it's like you have 3 employees and by default, this person is tagged this, they're kind of ambivalent at this point. Usually they're a little scared. They don't know what it is. They don't understand it. And so for those, we kind of hold their hand and we're just going to kind of take care of it for them. We are also, and this is a side note, we have been actively working in lobbying agencies to hire professional records management staff. And this particularly holds true for larger agencies. But at this point, given the duties that, and in many cases, they use this as like a public records officer. Well, that's fine too, right? They can share those duties depending on how big the agency is. The very large ones, no, those are 2 very different roles. However, we do really work on agencies, and we've seen some traction on that. It's been very happy to see that several medium to large agencies, so 300 to 1,000 people agencies, have in the last few years created proper classifications where they're hired as like a senior policy analyst, which is a standard sort of classification series, which is reasonably well compensated. This is their whole job, right? And so it's been given, it's a level that has enough authority. At some places we still have, it's somebody's admin support staff, and they begrudgingly do a little bit of this because they have to, and there's no silver bullet. But we do lobby heavily for the creation of, and we provide a ton of training to those individuals in those roles. We're trying to be more active about reaching out to them. So that's a lot of it too. It's a long game. It's a long game we play.
Okay, thanks, Kris. Any other questions? Give folks just a second. I'm not just going to scroll up and make sure that nothing was asked earlier. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything either. We'll give folks just a few more seconds.
And obviously some questions might come up to you later. I'm happy to accommodate those questions that you may have. I may not be able to get back to you instantly right now because I have a lot on my plate. But we're always happy to, we'll have meetings, we'll introduce the topics to other agents. We've talked to folks from other states before with their senior IT leadership to talk about what we're doing, just to kind of help them spur that as well. And we're happy to do that.
Okay, I'm not seeing anything else in the chat. So I'm going to close out of the chat box. If somebody pops in at the last minute, Lisa or Kris, would you please chime in and let me know? And my screen is frozen again. I'd like to thank Kris for presenting. I'd like to thank all of you for attending, and just would like to encourage all of you to stay in touch via COSA's website and the Resource Center, which is part of that website. We are still tweeting at this time. The handle is @StateArchivist, and also check out our Facebook page and YouTube channel. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good afternoon.